Meteorologist Brett Anderson here in the 1011 Weather Center. We are going to be starting our weather workshop here in less than 2 minutes. We're just making sure everything is working out here, so just stand on by. We're going to be talking about hurricanes today. And good afternoon. I think we're ready to start the weather workshop on hurricanes. I see that people are starting to log on, so hello to everyone. Thanks for joining us once again. We're going to talk about hurricanes today. It's something that Nebraska doesn't have to worry too much about, but you may travel the country, you may move to another part of the country someday, and you might want to know a little about hurricanes, and they are certainly the biggest storm system and most powerful storm system as far as a large storm on the planet. So it's something to talk about, and they can affect Nebraska weather, not as a hurricane, but sometimes the remnants can affect Nebraska. So we'll go into more details with that. Once again, thanks for everyone for joining us, and thanks to Allo for helping us out with this project. All right, so we're going to move on now. We're going to take a look at hurricanes and how they form and where they form. So basically, there's the equator. That's the equator right there, that purplish line there, the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. And then we have what's called the tropic zone, and that kind of is where the yellow is for both sides, the tropics and northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere. It's usually in this area that most of the hurricanes will form. This is where we have the warmest waters, and warmest waters will come into play here coming up in just a little bit. So warm waters, that's what we need. That's one of the ingredients. And usually the waters have to be over 80 degrees. 80 plus is best for hurricane development. You get much cooler than that, and hurricanes have a hard time developing. So that's, again, what we need. That's some of the ingredients. Now, hurricanes can form in the Gulf of Mexico. They can form anywhere in that warm water. But a lot of times what happens, especially in the Atlantic basin, the Atlantic hurricane, season, well, what we have coming off Africa, you see those three lines there? That's what we're indicating tropical waves, or waves coming off the African coast there. They come out into the ocean, and they provide some energy, and then we start to have thunderstorms that develop. And of course, we've talked about this before. We first, have evaporation, the rising water, again, the very warm water. That water vapor becomes clouds, and eventually it becomes thunderstorms. And then eventually numerous thunderstorms start to develop around this disturbance, this tropical wave, if you will. And numerous thunderstorms start to develop, and these thunderstorms also produce a lot of energy. Remember, warm water can contain a lot of energy. So when this water vapor condenses into liquid, clouds, thunderstorms, it releases a lot of energy. Now, because the Earth spins on its axis, which we've talked about before, that gives us what's called the Coriolis effect, or the Coriolis force, and that gets the storm spinning. It's a low pressure system, so in the northern hemisphere, it is spinning counterclockwise. So again, the more thunderstorm activity, the more energy, and the faster the storm spins, the pressure falls, and again, the storm system begins to intensify. So then eventually, you have a hurricane. Now, it does go in stages. It just doesn't become a hurricane right away. And again, we'll talk about that. Now, officially, a hurricane becomes a hurricane, or we call it a hurricane, when the sustained wind speed is 74 miles per hour. That's basically a steady 74 mile per hour wind in the hurricane. So sometimes I get questions from students, and even here, why doesn't Nebraska get hurricanes? And we've already kind of went through some of the ingredients. It's because, so first of all, hurricanes need warm ocean water. So as the hurricane moves across the warm ocean water, it's constantly provided with energy or with fuel, so to speak. So again, the hurricane runs out of that warm, moist air when it hits land, and once it hits land, it begins to weaken. So that's why once they move inland, they start to weaken rapidly. Now, there can be we call remnants of a tropical storm system or a hurricane. That means they eventually just give us clouds, and some areas sometimes you can see a lot of rainfall, but they no longer have the high wind speed associated with that hurricane. Now, another thing that can happen besides just moving on into land is if a hurricane moves into an area where the water is colder, below 80 degrees, hurricanes will begin to weaken as well. So they need the warm ocean water to sustain and become powerful. So that is why Nebraska will never see a hurricane unless something cataclysmic happens, right, Brandon?
Right.
Because we need an ocean front to have a hurricane, and we're not on the coast, so that's not going to happen. As I mentioned, there have been times where remnants can move inland, may become associated with a regular low-pressure system in the kind we see around here, the storm systems, the extratropical low-pressure systems, if you will, and that can produce a lot of rainfall, which in some cases can lead to flooding. So that is a possibility, but again, we do not have the strong winds when that happens. So a lot of times these hurricanes will hit the United States. Now this one, it looks like it's hitting Georgia and South Carolina, but as you know, many times the hurricanes can cross Florida or move south of Florida, and they can move right into the Gulf of Mexico, and sometimes they hit Texas or Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, this whole area, of course, along that Gulf Coast and the East Coast are vulnerable to hurricanes. Now, one of the reasons sometimes New York City can see a hurricane is because there's a little area, a little stream called the Gulf Stream. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It's an area of warm water that travels just to the east in the ocean, just to the east of the East Coast. So sometimes those hurricanes, as they move to the northeast, can actually remain strong, intensify, and sometimes that's why they can hit places like New York City. Doesn't happen very often, doesn't hit New York very often, but sometimes it can hit Boston, and even Maine can sometimes get hit by hurricanes because of that warmer water, that Gulf Stream that has warm water, and that's why sometimes the East Coast is threatened by hurricanes. Some people ask me, well, California is along an ocean. They have the ocean front. How come they don't get hurricanes? Well, in that part of the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, there's what is called upwelling and cold currents. So there's a lot colder water off the California coast. So therefore, hurricanes cannot survive in that cold water. Sometimes, if you go further south towards Mexico, where the water is warmer, you will get a hurricane that starts to move towards California and will start to weaken. But sometimes there's enough energy where it might be a tropical storm moving into California or far southern Arizona. That is rare, but a full-fledged hurricane is very rare in hitting Southern California. So Los Angeles, can't say never will see a hurricane, but it is very unlikely, and certainly places like San Francisco, almost unheard of to ever see any kind of a hurricane. So that, again, is why California doesn't see hurricanes. So we're going to move on, and again, this is where hurricanes form and what they are called. Now, in the United States, the Gulf of Mexico, as you can see, the United States, or the East Coast, even towards Hawaii, in this part of the world, they're called hurricanes, and we're familiar with that. But if you ever heard the term typhoon, have you ever heard of the term cyclones? Well, they're the exact same thing. They're the exact same storm, but they're just called a different name in a different part of the world. So in the Western Pacific, they're called typhoons, Eastern Pacific, they're hurricanes around the United States, Hawaii. In the Atlantic basin, they are called hurricanes. But if you go into the Indian Ocean or by Australia, they are called cyclones. But again, they are the same storm. So a cyclone is a hurricane is a typhoon. They are just different names. So when you hear about a typhoon hitting China or Japan, it basically is a hurricane. It's the same structure. All right, so again, those are where the hurricanes are most likely to be in that orange there and their paths. So here's a little bit of tropical climatology or hurricane climatology. And basically, we start to see the peak. This is where the peak hurricane or tropical season is, and it's usually between September 1st and October 1st. And, that's kind of, around here it starts to get a little bit on the cold side, but keep in mind the ocean waters, the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic, has had all summer to heat up. So by September, that water is pretty warm, a lot of times well over 80 degrees. Sometimes the water can be in the upper 80s to near 90 degrees. So there's a lot of warm water there, and that means a lot of fuel, and that's why the tropical or hurricane activity increases dramatically at the end of August, September, and into October. So again, the peak for hurricanes is in September, mid-September, and even into early October. Starts in August and then peaks in September. Now, one of the reasons, we've talked about tornadoes and the enhanced Fujita scale, the ranking of tornadoes. Well, hurricanes also have a scale. And when we talk about a Category 1 hurricane, that's between 74 and 95 miles per hour. But before we go too much further into the Saffir-Simpson scale, I want to talk about the stages before it becomes a hurricane, before the storm becomes hurricane. We talked about a tropical wave that comes off of the coast of Africa or could develop in the ocean. And then what happens is you start getting a few thunderstorms, maybe a little bit of low pressure. You have what's called a tropical depression. It's not named at that point. It's just called a tropical depression. And that's at about 30 miles per hour. When the sustained wind is at about 30 miles per hour, that's a tropical depression. Now, between 39 miles per hour, when it hits 39, that becomes a tropical storm. That's when it gets a name. So it actually will get a name before it becomes a hurricane. So it gets a name at 39 miles per hour, and then as we talked about, once the sustained winds hit 74 miles per hour, that's when it becomes a hurricane. So the Category 1 between 74, 95 miles per hour, Category 2, 96 mile per hour winds, 110 mile per hour winds. Remember, these are the average sustained winds. We're not even talking about the wind gusts. So damage with the Category 2 can be extensive, and then once we get to the Category 3, that's what we call a major hurricane, and that's 111 to 129, and of course Category 4, 130, 156, and finally the Category 5 is 157, and that is catastrophic, of course. That is a lot of damage, and we'll talk about some Category 5s coming up here in just a little bit. In fact, let's talk a little bit about some of the hurricanes recently. Just also wanted to show you what they look like from space. As you probably have seen on TV, this is what a hurricane is. This is Hurricane Katrina, and at one point it was a Category 5 over the Gulf of Mexico. It hit landfall in Alabama, Mississippi, and New Orleans as a Category 3 back in 2005, but this caused devastating flooding in New Orleans, and a lot of people lost their lives. So that's one of the big hurricanes that took a lot of lives, unfortunately, back in 2005. This next one is Hurricane Harvey, and this was in 2017, and this was a big one because it produced a lot of rainfall, a tremendous amounts of flooding. That's the other thing that tropical systems can do, especially if they're moving very, very slow or they stall. There's so much moisture they can dump a lot of rainfall. We're going to talk about, well, in fact, Harvey at one place in southeast Texas provided 60 inches of rainfall, 60 inches of rainfall in southeast Texas in a place called Nederland, Texas. Again, we'll talk more about that in just a bit. Hurricane Dorian was in 2019, and that was a powerful storm system. Oh, excuse me, this is Hurricane Florence. I apologize for that. This was September 2018, and Category 4 was a Category 4. And then Dorian, that's the one I wanted to talk about. This was Category 5. This was one of the strongest hurricanes ever in the Atlantic. In fact, it's the second strongest landfalling hurricane in the Atlantic, and it devastated the Bahamas. It just sat there for days by the Bahamas and just caused destruction. Peak wind gusts, or I should say the sustained wind gust, 185 miles per hour. So that was a Category 5, and that was just last fall in 2019. Sometimes it becomes so active that we have what's called a hurricane train. This actually shows 3 hurricanes, but sometimes I've seen as much as 4 or 5 stretched all across the Atlantic Ocean, and sometimes the Pacific as well. So that's what we call a hurricane train. Now in 2020, the upcoming season, these are the names. These are the names that will be used in 2020. Now, the National Hurricane Center comes up with these names. Now, these are the Atlantic names, not the Pacific names. We're only going to focus on the Atlantic names today. It's actually a rotation. It's a 6-year rotation. Now, if there's a big hurricane or a destructive hurricane, the name is retired. Like Hurricane Katrina that we talked about, there will never be another Hurricane Katrina because that name is retired. If, let's say, Hurricane Arthur develops this year, never hits land, never causes any problems, the name Arthur will be used again 6 years from now. It's a 6-year rotation. So if Bertha ends up being a destructive storm, it will be retired and Bertha will never be used again. So you can kind of see the names we're going to use. So maybe your name is on there, and again, that'll be the 2020 names, and again, if they're not retired, they'll be around again in 2026. So that is what we have with the names coming up this year. So again, that's just kind of a review of hurricanes. Again, want to thank meteorologists Jan Reichert and Bill Rentschler for the research and the graphics, and I think we're going to get into some questions now. I do have one question already from Harlow, and he is 7 and he's in first grade, and he wants to know how much rain in Lincoln has fallen in one storm. And I looked this up, and we also had this a few weeks ago with Ken Shimmick. He talked about some of the extremes, but the biggest 24-hour period in Lincoln, the most rainfall, was 8 inches and 3,800 hundredths. So just over 8 inches of rainfall, and that happened in August of 1910. So 8 inches. The most rain in one storm in Nebraska happened in York in July of 1950, and that was 13 inches of rain, just over 13 inches of rain in just one storm. Now, I talked about this earlier. This is Hurricane Harvey. This has a record of having the biggest storm total as far as rainfall on record. And again, Hurricane Harvey 2017, Nederland, Texas, picking up 60 inches of rain. The average rainfall in Lincoln, just the average rain that we see a year in Lincoln, is only about 28 inches. And they got 60 inches of rain in just one storm system. So they had, of course, significant flooding with that. All right, so do we have any other questions? Brandon is here monitoring the questions, and we hope to get to as many as we can this afternoon. What do you got?
Well, let's start with one that you just recently talked about, the names of hurricanes. Someone wants to know, Jackie wants to know, why isn't XYZ names on the list?
XYZ, who said that again?
Jackie.
Jackie wants to know why there's not XYZ, and I believe Q is not on that.
Q,
right.
Correct.
Right. One of the reasons why is simply there's just not a lot of names associated with those letters. So if you were to imagine if the few selected names that do start with X, Y, and Z and Q, we would at some point maybe run out of it because there's just not that many. So that's one of the reasons why they do not use those letters for names. So that's the reason, I think, is the main reason, right? That they just don't have that many names. I mean, I suppose we can make up names, but that would be interesting.
Right, and then if they have to retire, then you'd have to come up with even more names, which you already have a lower amount of names.
Right.
Like Q, X.
Just think, if there were only 5 Q names that you can think of, and then at some time over history, all those names got retired, then what do you do? So that's exactly why we don't use those names.
Because the list, and you may have mentioned this, the list, it's 6 lists that they use. It rotates every 6 years. And did you know that, have we ever run past, this is a bonus question for anybody who may want to think about this.
Yeah.
Have we ever run out of names?
Have we ever run out of names? Do you want me to answer that, or see
Yes,
if
go
anybody?
ahead.
You want me to answer
Yeah,
it?
you-
Oh,
let
thank
you
you.
answer that.
I appreciate that. The question is, have we ever run out of names? And the answer is yes. And I believe the last time that happened was in 2005.
Yes.
Was an extremely active year. We actually had to go into alpha. We used, was it
The
alpha?
Greek alphabet.
Yeah, we used the Greek alphabet. After we ran out of the alphabet, the regular alphabet, we used the Greek alphabet. Alpha, beta, Charlie. Was it Charlie?
Yeah.
Is that, yeah?
I believe so.
I don't, something like, yeah. Anyway, that's what happens when it
You got most of it.
Yep.
We're in the halfway through the question part anyway.
Mhm.
That's weird. That computer has hardly ever done that. Maybe I'll talk to Leslie and maybe we need to get a box on that one too.
Yep.
Because I have not seen it be an issue over here anymore.
I guess he says we're back now. Hello? Oh, I guess we're back. Can you guys hear us?
Oh.
Now there's audio. Matt says now there's audio. Okay.
All right.
All right. All right. Well, it is getting kind of late here, but maybe we'll try to get a few more questions. All right. I don't know where we left off. I don't know what. I think we went off. Somebody asked about tornadoes, if tornadoes and hurricanes are the same. They are low pressure, but again, they form differently. They're different. Tornadoes develop from thunderstorms, usually what we call supercell thunderstorms. And then, of course, hurricanes are kind of a conglomeration of all kinds of thunderstorms, numerous thunderstorms creating kinds of energy. And then somebody asked which one is stronger. Well, tornadoes can actually have the strongest winds, over 300 miles per hour. Most of the time, hurricanes don't go over 200 miles per hour. So, again, yes, the hurricane is much bigger, and the tornado is a much smaller storm system, but the tornado does have, again, the higher wind speed. That's another thing I was going to talk about. Actually, hurricanes can produce tornadoes. Now, they're usually not real strong tornadoes, but what happens is when hurricanes tend to hit land, it causes friction. The wind hits the land, so the wind by the surface, by the ground, actually slows down a little bit and then can cause a rotation. So yes, landfalling hurricanes can produce tornadoes. So you can get hurricanes, you get tornadoes, you get storm surge, which is the water rushing in from the ocean and flooding areas. You get extremely heavy rain, and of course, the very high winds. What else do we have?
Oh, let's see here. There was a good one, and I lost it. Let's go with Owen wants to know, and you may have mentioned this, but just to recap in case they missed it, which hurricane holds the record for causing the most damage?
That would take a little more research. I can tell you that the deadliest hurricane in the United States history is the Galveston hurricane, which happened in 1900. There's estimates anywhere between 6,000 and 12,000 people died. The official is between 6,000 and 8,000, but I've seen some reports that maybe up to 12,000 people died. That was way back in 1900, before we had satellites and radar to track these storm systems, and that hit Galveston, Texas. So that is the deadliest, not only the deadliest hurricane, but the deadliest disaster the United States has ever had. So I can tell you that's the deadliest. The thing about what's the most destructive is that when things go up, there's inflation. Anytime you have a powerful hurricane and it hits a populated area, it can become the new most destructive hurricane. At one point it was Katrina, and before that it was Andrew. I'm not sure if Katrina is still number one, because we've had a couple of other hurricanes, especially like Harvey, that caused all the flooding in Houston. That's probably up there as well as far as destruction.
According to what I've seen on a quick search here, and again, we can delve into this a little further later, but I believe Katrina is still number one. $160 billion in damage.
Whoa.
Harvey was number two with $125 billion.
All right. If you didn't hear that, Katrina, as far as actual damage, and in the United States, $160 billion in damage, and that was Katrina 2005, and then Harvey, which happened in 2017, which wasn't necessarily a destructive windstorm. It was of flooding for the most part, and that's number two. All right. So, all right, thanks for that research there, Brandon.
Yeah, did a little quick search there. Maybe mention again exactly why are they called different things in different places. Why is it a hurricane in the Atlantic, but typhoon, cyclone elsewhere?
I think that's just maybe due to the culture in that part of the world. I don't know if there's any particular reason why. It's just that they're called hurricanes here, and I believe A lot of those typhoons affect the Asian continent, the Asian countries, and typhoons. That's really, I think the only reason why is just because it's different parts of the world, and they call them different things. Like, some people, we call them tornadoes. Some people in the United States might call them twisters. And even in The Wizard of Oz, in the original movie, Dorothy called it a cyclone. So I think in the older days of the United States, a lot of people called tornadoes cyclones. Now we tend to just call them tornadoes, but some of us still call them twisters. Brandon's researching
What
right
is
now.
it? Yeah, I'm trying to look at questions and do a little research here just
Yep.
in case. What is Matthew wants to know, what is the best source of shelter if a hurricane is happening in your area?
Well, Matthew wants to know what's the best form of shelter if you're in a hurricane. The first thing is if you're along the coast and the public authorities say that you need to evacuate, that's the best thing to do. The thing about hurricanes that are different than tornadoes, yes, we do have advance warning with possibility of tornadoes, but we still don't know exactly where those tornadoes are going to touch down. We see these hurricanes. We generally know what direction they're moving and what land they're going to hit. So there's usually sometimes days before that hurricane actually hits. So there's what is called evacuation orders, and people are supposed to leave the beach areas right along the coast and go to higher ground. So evacuation would be the safest thing to do. Now, if you happen to get stuck in one, obviously a concrete, very well-built structure you would have to be in to protect yourself. And of course, you can't go necessarily into the basement, even if there is a basement, because there certainly could be massive flooding associated with that. So if you had to ride out a hurricane, you better hope that you're in a very sturdy structure because, if it's a strong one of over 130, 40, 50 miles per hour, you're probably at least going to lose your roof and the walls and stuff could collapse as well. All right?
All right, one more, you think?
Yeah. Here's an interesting question. I've never heard of this. Laura Andrews asks, or for Aaron wants to know if two hurricanes have ever combined. And I don't know if I've ever seen that. I think theoretically something like that could happen, but I've never actually heard of two hurricanes combining.
Yeah, I can't recall a time when that's happened. Can't say
Yep.
that it wouldn't. I mean, I could see like maybe
One starts to weaken,
remnants
yeah.
maybe meets up with another one.
Exactly. See, sometimes what happens when hurricanes move over, a lot of times it really, causes a lot of waves. And the ocean is very, very rough, and sometimes it actually can help bring cooler air, I should say cooler water, from the lower parts of the ocean, and it gets it up to the top. So sometimes hurricanes that might be behind that might actually weaken because there's now colder water rather than the warm water. So sometimes that's why hurricanes, if they move in the path of another hurricane, they will start to actually weaken instead of intensifying. So I don't think it's physically impossible for two hurricanes or tropical systems to converge. It's just very, very rare, and I haven't actually heard of any case of that happening.
I can't recall either. All right. So one last one.
All right.
Because this will be a good trivia question.
Trivia question time.
What is the highest? This is Alyssa asking. What is the highest recorded speed of a hurricane in history?
The highest wind speed. The highest wind speed, is that what she wants to know?
I would assume that was
Okay.
the highest wind speed.
I am trying to remember from memory, because I know at one point it was 232 miles per hour, and it was from a typhoon in the Pacific, but I can't remember where. But there might have been a more recent one that set a new record. Do you have anything over there?
Well, I have as far as the Atlantic Basin,
Uh-huh.
what is the highest, and that would be Hurricane Allen in 1980, 190 miles per hour.
Hurricane Allen, 190 miles per hour. Now, Allen did not hit as a Category 5, but that was the highest sustained wind. It was probably over the ocean. So that was, and I mentioned that, so I know that there was a stronger one in the Pacific, the typhoon, that had a wind gust of over 230 miles per hour.
There apparently was a Hurricane Patricia in the western hemisphere that formed in the Pacific in 2015 with 215 mile per hour winds.
Patricia, near the Philippines, is that what you said? Or just
In the Pacific.
In the Pacific, 215 mile per hour sustained winds. So that's interesting. As far as Category 5s hitting the United States, I believe we have, is it 4 now or 5? Because I know one was recently upgraded. We had the Labor Day hurricane of 1935. Now, see, before the 1950s, there were no names for hurricanes. We started giving them names to track them in the 1950s. So 1935 Labor Day hurricane was a Category 5. That hit the Florida Keys. Then we had Hurricane Camille in 1969, which hit Mississippi. Then we had Hurricane Andrew, which is an interesting story because this hit in 1992, and officially, at least at the time, it was a Category 4. But after scientists did about 10 years of research at the damage, they believed that it actually intensified to a Category 5 just before it hit south of Miami in Florida. So Andrew, Category 3, or excuse me, Category 5, which happened in 1992, and I believe there was one, wasn't there one just recently that was it Mitch or?
Michael.
Michael, I was way off, but I had the M name right.
Yes, you're
And that was what year? That was just
2018.
2018, Michael, and was that
And it was,
Florida?
Let's see, at the time of landfall, yes, it was near Mexico Beach and Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida.
In Florida. So that means that if I remembered my counting, that was 4. That's 4 Category 5s actually making landfall in the United States. So Category 5s don't hit the United States very often, but we have had them from time to time.
Yes.
All right, I think, sorry for the technical problems. That just kind of came out of the blue, wasn't expecting that. So we apologize for that. Again, if we didn't get to your questions, we will get back to you and answer your questions. So thank you very much again for staying with us through all this. And hopefully on Tuesday, I believe Ken's going to have, I think Ken on Tuesday is going to have kind of a quiz.
Yes.
We're going to have a quiz on maybe what we've been learning so far this year. So hopefully you'll remember, and we'll have that quiz on Tuesday's edition at 1 o'clock. So thank you very much. Again, stay safe and have a great weekend, and hope you join us again on Tuesday at 1 o'clock. Take care.